Hi guys, it's Debbie, and finally that time of the year has arrived when I get to make one of my favourite videos about my favourite films of the year. This year expanding from 5 to 10 as the film industry is finally back on track after a couple of unusual years. My worst films of the year video will also be linked as soon as it's available, and of course, as every year, I would love to hear what you think about all these titles that I talk about, as well as what you enjoyed watching the most in 2022. Before we get into the list, here's the usual premise that I say every year. It's impossible to watch everything in time for this video. Some titles aren't even available to the general public. For example, I haven't watched The Whale, I haven't watched White Noise, but let's get to the films I have watched, the ones I enjoyed the most, and let's open up the list with a film that was probably quite predictable. You probably expect me to talk about it, Everything Everywhere All at Once, a film which you will see basically on all best films of the year listed. It has already received multiple awards, nominations, it's had multiple nominations for the Golden Globes, and I expect it to be a big title at next year's Oscars.
I am paying attention.
Everything Everywhere All at Once is the ultimate multiverse film without the superheroes. Michelle Yeoh portrays a laundromat owner who, upon going to attend an IRS audit, finds out that they're basically other parallel universes with multiple different versions of herself, who, without spoilers, need to use their different skills to stop a dangerous threat the multiverse is facing. This film is an absolute roller coaster with countless unexpected shots, references, emotional moments, jokes thrown at the viewer, but not in a chaotic or headache-inducing manner, but in a manner which allows you to enjoy it more and analyze it more every time you watch it because of all the references and Easter eggs, especially if you are a film lover. I also love how a film that on paper sounds like an absolute chaotic, quirky mess somehow turned out to be one of the most loved films of the last years in such a short time span. But let's move on to the next film, as with 10 titles we have quite a lot to talk about. The next film on the list is Triangle of Sadness.
Enjoy the moment. No?
I didn't read much about this film, but there was something about it that was just screaming that I would love it. And I did. I loved it so much. And to be honest, given the way the story evolves, I'm so pleased I didn't Google too much about it. Unfortunately, it did end up in the mainstream regular news anyway because of the death of one of the main actors, Charlie Dean, but trust me, she really left us with a great performance here. In the film, she portrays an influencer who is dating a model. The two often bicker about various aspects of their relationship, mostly revolving about money and popularity and gender roles. And although it is clear that they do care for one another, it's also obvious that this is a partnership more than a relationship in order to gain more popularity and success from one another and the social connections that they have. And money and power are the key elements to this film, as most of it is set on a super yacht with super rich guests who basically use and abuse of their power, ended up treating everybody else in an awful manner. But is being a millionaire or even a billionaire really worth anything when things get rough on the yacht and all the normal hierarchy that would usually be out there just falls to pieces? This is all analysed on the backdrop of heavy metal, people projectile vomiting, toilets exploding, sewer, diarrhea, water, Woody Harrelson having drunk discussions in the dark with Russian oligarchs. It's beautiful. I knew Robert Austin was going to destabilize us because even his previous film, The Square, unsettles you with scenes and dialogues which are so random and chaotic and unexpected, but Triangle of Sadness just really tops it all. Another title I absolutely loved watching this year was On the Count of Three, a film which unfortunately wasn't able to reach beyond its status of just lesser known dark indie comedy, but it's beautiful, bleak and beautiful.
I just said our last words. Why are you trying to one-up me?
The premise of this film is very blunt. Two best friends who are both struggling with mental health and who have both attempted suicide decide to enjoy together one last day on Earth before doing it, dying together. If that's pretty depressing, imagine how the dialogues progress throughout the story and the dark places that are explored as their last hours progress. But at the same time, always with a lot of dark humour, because the characters realise that when you have nothing left to lose, you start to have a very different perspective on a lot of things in life. That sounds like the premise to a wannabe edgy movie, a dark comedy with quirky lines about life and death. Instead, it's very down to earth, like, what music are you going to listen to in your last hours? And also, you don't suddenly become an ancient wise philosopher the moment you realise you're going to die. You're still the same dude, but who cares less about the usual social constructs. So although there are many funny moments, the film never plays down the seriousness of the topics, and by the end of the film, you're laughing, crying, everything in between. This film really proves how smaller productions can sometimes amaze you more than much bigger titles. And to be honest, compared to other years, this year's list is the king of smaller productions lists. And I know you're expecting me to talk about this next film, so let's just talk about it and get it out of the way. Funny Pages. I've talked about this film so much, you're probably sick of hearing about it, but trust me, you have to watch it. Don't expect a huge production, don't expect huge, beautiful CGI and makeup. This film is not on the same technical level as some other titles that were released this year and other titles on today's list. But to me, it's very special, and it really proves how you can make a great realistic story without necessarily having 3D dinosaurs coming out of an IMAX screen. Funny Pages is a story of a young aspiring cartoonist. He's got the talent but no money, not many connections in the business, so he's trying to find inspiration and connections while trying to get by. And the story is mostly about all the odd and different people he meets along this journey and the different ways they try to influence him. For example, his parents, who are always trying to discourage him from following this path. His best friend, who's always breathing down his neck and with strong opinions on his work. He ends up stuck in legal troubles. And one person in particular in the story is a guy who he meets at his lawyer's office and with whom he shares a wild part of the film.
I wasn't an artist. Nobody get all excited.
Funny Pages doesn't have conventionally beautiful people. It doesn't have conventionally beautiful locations, jobs, daily activities. Watching this film felt like I was just standing in the street next to these people, listening to them talk. To give you an idea of the vibe, it was produced by the Safdie brothers, the directors of Good Time and Uncut Gems. Now, this film does have high ratings, but it wasn't as well received as most of the other titles on today's list. And I think the reason is that it went through the same process that occurred with Kajillionaire, which is a film that was released a few years ago and which was totally advertised as a comedy, whereas it went down a different path. I think many people are expecting Funny Pages to just be all funny and full of jokes because that's kind of what the trailer implies. Whereas, for example, one of the main topics of the film is the sadness of struggling to do what you want to do in life. Anyway, I'll leave it to you to watch it, form your opinion, and let me know what you think about it. Moving on, we have Broker, a film I didn't expect to impact me as much as it did. I thought it was just a light-hearted, simple story. I should have known better, known who the director was, Hirokazu Koreda, who has always talked about deep family stories. But Broker did surprise me so much, and I remember a few months back when I first watched this film, I immediately thought this is going to be in my best films of the year video. Broker is the story of a young woman who leaves her baby at one of those baby boxes where you can give up babies safely instead of abandoning them in the street. But instead of the proper authorities picking up that baby, it is taken by two men who run a child trafficking scheme. Their defense, what they say, is that many people can't adopt children because they don't have the necessary requirements, they aren't married, they don't have references, and they claim that the adoption system in general doesn't work and many kids end up being orphans for their whole lives. Anyway, the woman who was giving away her baby and the men who took it eventually meet and end up going on a wild road trip all together in which they slowly get to know each other and discuss a series of uncomfortable topics which force the viewer to try to think of certain matters from a different perspective. So you have these beautiful shots, this beautiful cinematography, wonderful acting, while the film is forcing you to think of topics such as abortion, prostitution, murder, but seen from a different perspective, because somebody else will have a different point of view depending on what they've been through in life. But let's move along the list. Next up we have Chacha Real Smooth, probably the most simple film on today's list, but which has won so many people's hearts. I don't think I have read one really negative review about this film. Chacha Real Smooth is the story of a guy who's still trying to figure out his life, and he ends up finding a job that I didn't even know existed, a party starter. Basically, that person that at parties makes sure that everybody's dancing, everybody's having fun and so on. He mostly does this at his community's bar and bat mitzvahs, so over time it's more or less the same guests over and over, and he starts to get to know them better, and he eventually falls in love with a mum portrayed by Dakota Johnson. The two of them actually get quite close because she has an autistic daughter, and he's one of the few people who makes sure she is also having fun at parties and is doing well in general, and interacts with her as a normal person without baby talking her or treating her differently. And the actress who portrays her is autistic, so props to director Cooper Rafe for that. I think what so many people loved about this film is that the relationship that develops between the characters is very realistic. It even often goes a way we really don't want it to go, and which completely defies the normal tropes of a rom-com. It's not all steamy sex with a MILF, it's about trust and friendship, and can this relationship actually work? Is it actually something feasible. So it's a feel-good movie, but one that you could actually see happening in real life. And sometimes it's nice to watch a film about really nice people.
It's fine. It's so cute. It's so good.
No, Mom, if anybody sees that, I'm gonna get put on a watch list.
Moving on, I have to include RRR. I know, I can already hear the screams in the background. Where is Top Gun Maverick? How could you put this in and not Avatar? I personally think RRR is a great movie, and there's also a specific reason why I decided to include it today. RRR is an Indian film, and India produces many films every year. It's basically the biggest film industry in the world. Not all of their films are great, it happens, some of them are. But the problem is that many people in the West don't even bother watching them because of this stigma of Indian movies being awful, of being these really long musicals with ridiculous special effects and unrealistic plots. But RRR smashed all those stereotypes. It reached the West, so many people watched it and are probably going to be intrigued by watching more Indian films in the future. As a matter of fact, this is probably the first time I've seen a modern Indian film on many Western best films of the year list. I'll leave my full review to the film linked, but to describe it briefly, RRR is a story of two men from completely different backgrounds whose lives end up connecting after the abduction of a young girl. I'm going to leave it at that without spoilers. And I think what completely blew many people's minds is that this film has wonderful cinematography and effects which many people wouldn't usually expect from Indian productions. And this is, as I often say, one of those films which, if it had been made in Hollywood with more famous actors, would have been way more successful. Just saying. Next up we have The Northman by the great Robert Eggers, who just turned up one day and decided to drop The Witch and drop The Lighthouse, just as you do. Before watching The Northman, I was mostly expecting just a hunky action film, mostly focusing on these guys fighting and not much more. But I should have known better. I should have trusted Robert Eggers, as the film did have some great action sequences, but it was also really, really creepy, had a pretty emotional background, and it was beautifully shot. The Northman is the story of a man who's on a mission to avenge his father. He's hunting down the people who caused harm to his family, and nothing is going to stop him on that mission. One of the things I didn't expect from this film was the way it portrayed the peculiar beliefs the characters have, all their mythology, which is sometimes shown in a creepy manner.
Your fate is set and you cannot escape it.
As well as how raw and brutal and physical this film was. Watching this film, I felt cold and covered in mud and bleeding and crying. Next up we have Tar, a film which me and many other people thought was an actual real biography because of how well the protagonist is introduced. In Tar, Cate Blanchett portrays a successful orchestra conductor, probably the most renowned of her time, but who is on the verge of a downfall for reasons I won't tell you because you might not have seen the film yet. So as I was mentioning, this film feels like a real biography, the story of a real person. It feels like there's a full lore about the protagonist with whom you can't really emphasize. While she is successful and talented, she is very unlikable, and it doesn't get better as the film moves on. It opens with what is basically a full breakdown of all the accomplishments this incredible composer has reached, and then it unravels into a spiral of madness, dark secrets, unethical choices, the ego of a master. But now we have reached the last film on today's list, and the film I watched the most recently, The Fabelmans. To be honest, I initially wasn't particularly attracted to this film. I thought the trailer looked a little boring. Also, I kept on seeing these reviews about this being the film we've all been waiting for 40 years. A mind-blowing masterpiece, and I was influenced by that when I watched it. Because throughout it, I kept on thinking about all those words, and I wasn't feeling the same way. It was a great film. I cried throughout it, I loved it, but I just wasn't feeling that same way. So I was thinking I was missing something, and by the end I thought, well, I just don't like it. So I was upset, I went home. And then I just couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept on thinking of more and more scenes, of more and more connections in the beautiful cinematography, the acting. And I read more about it and I realized this really is an impactful film. I did enjoy it. Not necessarily in the same manner as that wording I had read. For me, this is not the film I was waiting for all my whole life. The Fabelmans is basically the story of acclaimed director Steven Spielberg during his early years, in which he fell in love with cinema, and his relationship with his family, which then influenced his later works. Michelle Williams, Paul Dano were amazing at portraying his parents with all their flaws and their love and the choices they had to make, and I think this film perfectly describes how, without our passions, we aren't ourselves. We might put them aside for a while, we might have other priorities in our life, but they're always calling us and they are always a comfort for us when we go back to them. As a film lover, I've always said whatever happens to me in life, films will always be there for me, just as filmmaking has always been there for Steven Spielberg.
What was your favorite part?
And on that beautiful note, we have reached the end of today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. Of course, I would love to hear what you liked watching in 2022, what you thought about these titles I spoke about today, so make sure to leave a comment down below. See you in the next video.